Hello, Andrew. How are you?
I'm well, Mike. Sorry to hear you're under the weather a little bit, but
And a little bit of a cold.
that's how it goes. How are you?
So, I'm good, and I'm really excited about our conversation today. And Andrew, just for those who are watching, Andrew Petty is a person that I have worked with personally. He was a leadership life coach or executive coach for the Foundry for quite a while. And I just learned so much and gained so much from my work with Andrew. And why don't you kind of talk a little bit about who you are, what you do, and then I want to jump into the discussion about the hero's journey and how that applies to addiction and kind of some of the things that we were talking about when we had coffee recently.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. On kind of a meta level, which is where I like to operate, and I know you do some too, Mike. What I do in the world as a human is, as far as I can tell, is I'm always seeking deeper understanding about how to live our lives in such a way that we get great results with them. And that seems to be something I've been doing all my life. No matter where I've been, that thread runs through it. And over the past 8 years and change, I've parlayed that into a life and leadership coaching capacity. And that basically just ends up being another avenue for me to pursue my, a prime vocation, which is seeking deeper understanding about how to conduct ourselves in the world so we can get great results with our lives. And as I work with clients and as I just do my own investigation in the world and live my own life, various insights and things come into the mix that then help me serve people even more. So when we worked together at the Foundry many moons ago, I was in the earlier stages of that process. And ever since, as I've continued to follow the breadcrumbs that have presented themselves, it has appeared I've begun to sort of assemble a set of provisions and a pathway and a paradigm that I'm now interested in deploying with various, for lack of a better word, it's very impersonal, various populations who have needs that are particularly well suited to this paradigm, this pathway, and these provisions. And that's kind of where our paths intersected again, because I reached out to you and said, hey, I've got something that I think has value, but it needs hearts and ears that are already tuned to this frequency, to the where what I have and their specific kind of need intersect well. And I began to think of the recovery community,
Yeah.
of whom I consider myself to be sort of an honorary member, because just in this past year, I gave up alcohol as a new adventure in my own life. And so I'm in my own process of understanding what it's like to live apart from some inordinate level of dependence upon external kinds of coping things. So professionally, what I do looks like I have a podcast called Andrew Petty is Dying. I do one-on-one coaching with a lot of different kinds of people, from regular people like me and you who are just stuck in various ways to folks who are leading organizations, and also have a group called the Graveyard Group. And both my podcast called Andrew Petty is Dying and the Graveyard Group had this clear mortality influence, and that comes from my own story. And my attempt there is to help us cultivate the mortality mindset, which is essentially voluntary integration of awareness of our mortality into our daily lives, so that we can ultimately have lived a life that we're outrageously proud of when we die.
Yeah, that's awesome work. I love to hear about it. And when you had contacted me, it was so interesting that I had been going through this process where I was having this debate in my mind: is addiction treatment rehabilitation or habilitation?
Mm-hmm.
With the implication that rehabilitation implies that people have the skills and went through all the developmental stages, and that we're just going to sort of kind of help them get that back into their lives. And when you start talking about the hero's journey and the work that you do, and it's work that you did with me, and that was really powerful and really helpful. And I don't, I really appreciated the work that we did together, and I thought it was really beneficial. And I kind of came to this view in my own kind of 40 years of experience with addiction treatment, is that for large numbers, I used to say for young people in recovery, I don't say that anymore, because I've had more and more people in their late 30s and 40s, when they've heard me present, come up and say, man, that's why I relapse. I relapse because I don't know how to do things as an adult. Like
Mm-hmm.
I have been struggling since I was 14 with drugs and alcohol. And when I get sober, the shame of people recognizing how incompetent
Mm.
as an adult I am is what pushes me over that edge to where I relapse consistently. And when I talked with you about when you had reached out to me, and I thought, first of all, I thought, well, I don't want to put words in Andrew's mouth, like as to what he's doing, but it just seems to fit so well that is work that particularly men, but I think men and women, but for most men in recovery, recovery isn't just not using. Recovery is finding oneself. It is persevering through not just the problems that addiction has brought, but traumas and family struggles and other things that I really wanted to get your thoughts on it. And so I'm glad that we're doing this.
I am too.
So,
And every time we talk, I feel as if we could talk for several hours longer. And you were expressing your gratitude for our work together in the past, and man, the feeling is so mutual. Every time we talk, I find myself jotting down notes and finding phrases and concepts that I'm totally new to me, and so it's always just a pleasure of an experience. And that's putting it too lightly, because I always feel like my my thought and my learning advance several steps forward anytime we get a chance to talk. So it's just, there's such great conversations. So thank you for, I think, modeling the humility that we all need and that you could easily not have, because you're such a well-regarded figure in your field and have been at it for many years. It would be easy for you, I think, to rest on your laurels, or easy for someone in your position to rest on your laurels. But I continually see the evidence of exactly the opposite, that you're open to learning and hearing from whomever. And I am certainly of much lower professional pedigree, and I have many fewer letters behind my name, so to speak, than you. So I just appreciate that we get to have these kinds of conversations.
yeah, I really enjoy it. So, what is your thought about my basic premise? This idea of we have a large group of adult men struggling. I'll start with men coming into recovery without the foundation that treatment has sort of assumed was there.
Yeah. It struck me when you said it as immediately very likely that habilitation suits better than rehabilitation. And I think your observation suits a much broader audience than those who are in recovery. My experience, anecdotally, sample size of one, was that when I came into adulthood, there were a plethora of ways, some of which I was aware of and many of which I wasn't yet aware of, that I was not yet a mature and fully functioning adult. And some of us get stuck in that moment, and as we begin to become aware of our inadequacies as an adult, we quickly get into blame mode on our family of origin and all the things that did or didn't happen there that contributed to where we find ourselves. But unfortunately, as I know, if we stay too long in that place, then it's a recipe for resentment and powerlessness and all kinds of compounding miseries over the course of our lifetime. If we're able to get out of that, however, and realize that the baton of responsibility has been passed from our parents or whoever were our primary caregivers now to us as legal adults, then we can begin to go about the process of parenting ourselves to maturity. And that's what I've had to do over the course of my adulthood. And my innate wirings predisposed me to be interested in that work, and it also happened that I had a lot of that work to do. So I think this idea of habilitation versus rehabilitation applies, I would wager, to all of us who've entered adulthood, because none of us are fully mature adults when we come into adulthood, and all of us still have a lot of learning to do about how to be a highly functioning, contributing member of society as an adult. And so I think it's just useful to know that there may be then a specific subset of the population who have suffered from or become entangled in addictive behaviors as we commonly know them. That language may make special sense in that environment, because language like rehabilitation is typically used in that environment.
Right.
So I think it fits perfectly. There's certainly ways in which I used various external things to manage and console myself that prevented me from having to figure those areas out. And I think, like, I don't know if we were recording yet or not, but like I gave up alcohol this year because I realized alcohol was in the way of me growing up in some ways that I needed to grow up. So yeah, habilitation. I think that's where I began to see maybe there is a way for what I've been doing, quote, over here to be of particular benefit to an existing population of people who have begun this work of habilitation, as you're putting it. And I hope this really catches on, just this idea of habilitation versus the old, perhaps worn out idea of rehabilitation. The assumption there in rehabilitation, meaning, as you said earlier, that they were somehow at some level of baseline normal functioning. But that maybe perhaps more often than not was not the case.
Yeah, I think just about anyone who has significant developmental trauma, complex trauma, they spend so much of their time trying to be what people need them to be. They don't learn self-directedness very well. And I can speak for myself as someone with a significant history of developmental trauma. I'm really good in crisis. And I am not really good at planning. Anyone who knows me is probably rolling their eyes right now. And it dawned on me how I have used this sort of absent-minded professor kind of persona to not necessarily be fully functioning adult. I'm so much more comfortable in ideas and like, how do you put these things together than, the basic core, this is what needs to happen, because it didn't serve me as a kid. What served me was thinking things through. And so many clients that I kind of work with.
Mike, can I jump in real quick?
Sure.
Do you mean that when you were growing up, being thoughtful about planning and all those kinds of things didn't serve you because the environment didn't play ball with? I mean, it was an unpredictable, chaotic environment. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, they never happen.
Yeah.
So why do them? Like,
Right.
just be ready for the next thing,
Mm-hmm.
and stay in your head and do those kinds of things. And I think so often that's what I see with a lot of our clients is they're 25 years old. They have been using drugs and alcohol since they were 13. There's almost always a trauma somewhere in their family. And in the process, everyone assumes that it's the drugs and the alcohol. And that's why when I talk with families, I say, I want you to pay particular attention to the things that you think will go away when the person is in sobriety that don't go away. And those are the things that we really need to work on in terms of habilitating and growing and teaching. And so
that stuck with me a lot when you mentioned that when we had coffee the other day, or when we were on our call preparing for this. I don't remember which one it was, but just as I've observed myself in the absence of alcohol this year and have been, asking God to illuminate the beast within me, the nature of this beast that pursues it has an excessive appetite and pursues excessive consumption to feed itself. It was so enlightening me to hear that when you take away the substance, whatever it might be, the thing of choice that you've been using, keep an eye out for what complications remain, because that's where the work can happen. That was so enlightening to me. And that may be common knowledge in your field. I don't know, but I can tell you, for me, it was like, that gives me a different tool with which to parse out what I'm observing. Maybe this kind of went over here with the old alcohol involved behaviors as a manifestation of alcohol's presence in my life. And then these other things that remain are signs leading to learning about other parts of me that need tending and need to mature.
yeah, that's really kind of why I developed the Family Institute, to be able to teach families. These are the things that are most commonly associated with addiction. These are the things that are most commonly associated with trauma that the family's dealing with. And then when things are outliers and don't fit within those, we need to pay particular attention to those, because those are the things that may come from a lack of developmental kind of movement through the developmental stages. Could be any number of things. And I've had families say to me, my son's 27 years old. But now that he's sober, when he talks, he sounds like he's 13 years old. And it's like, well, we used to say in addiction treatment that where you started using is where you stopped growing developmentally. And I still think that's pretty true. And so when you were talking about the idea of working with these individuals, I thought what you had to offer was really unique and really interesting. And so I don't know if you want to kind of talk a little bit about how you envision your work with individuals in recovery, and let's just kind of go with a discussion about that.
Yeah. And as you asked me to be ready to share how that might happen. And of course, because I've yet to engage the recovery world actually with this stuff, I can only speculate as to how it would go. But of course, no plan survives first contact with the enemy, as they say in the military. Of course, the recovery folks wouldn't be the enemy, but we'd make a plan and then adjust as we went. I think actually what I'm going to share is very much what I would do with anyone who had evidence in their lives of areas of immaturity to whatever degree. And it might be useful to articulate a little bit of a perspective that I've acquired that seems to be holding up to testing in the real world. And it is that perhaps, especially in the 21st century, where we have a generation growing up that has been able to access the whole world and all of its inhabitants from their smartphone from day one. It's hard enough to cobble out or forge an accurate, as in based upon the human I really am, and deployable identity in the world. It's always been hard to do that. But when you can compare yourself to 7.9999999 other billion people in the world, and that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but not much, 24/7, and you've grown up being able to do that, then you have just infinitely compounded the challenges associated with creating an identity in the world. And to add to that, you've got a world that is apparently, it's very difficult to understand the state of the world because all of the sources have such heavy biases attached to them, and we have our own biases attached to us, but the degree of chaos and distrust and division seems remarkable. And for young people growing up who can, on the one hand, compare themselves to everyone in the world, and at the same time are surrounded by a lot of chaos, and then you add to that perhaps your own family of origin chaos, things done to you, and perhaps things you've done as well that have caused trauma, or of a upper or lowercase t variety.
Right.
I think we're in an age when people of all ages and stages need a lot of help developing an accurate and deployable identity in the world. And in the absence of the capacity or even the awareness of the need to do that, and with the ability to compare ourselves to several billion other people, and the standards for, what is the right way to say it, the measures for greatness that the world offers us, very often we will not attempt to figure out our own identity, but we'll go borrow one that seems to be culturally valued and appraised highly.
Yeah.
And so then maybe every once in a while that identity that we go and borrow actually fits our identity, but I think that's by far the exception rather than the norm. And so we begin to live out this script that isn't really ours. And then at some point, the jig's up. That script is not going to work any longer, and we'll either double down and try to make it work, which compounds our misery, or maybe more frequently, we'll kind of just bag that script. And a very common, this will be too simplistic an explanation, but a common contributor to a common scenario, like the 44-year-old husband and father of two, has a comfortable life, he's working late at his office one night and realizes he hates his life, hates his work, how did he get here, would be a very pedestrian example of how that script can run its course, and then the person is left wondering what to do. And hopefully they find their way forward, but more often than not, sometimes those situations end with the dissolution of a family and the repetition of destructive patterns. Minimally a lateral move forward, rather a lateral step than a step forward. But there are many other more catastrophic examples where the script runs its course and we turn to very dramatic self-destructive measures and today I think our culture is characterized by a lot of disillusionment, a lot of discouragement, a lot of apathy. And I think some of that is ours to own. And I think some of that we have to be aware is the soup within the very difficult soup within which we are immersed, or the milieu within which we find ourselves. So we first have to become aware that it's very difficult to create an identity in today's age and day. I think it's even more difficult, and we have to then assign value to create an identity, and then we have to begin finding a way to do that. And that's why I think people like me have specific valuable work to do these days, and you, is because we have an opportunity to help people when they're lost, rather than scrambling around attempting to avoid the reality of lostness and making it worse. Go, okay, yep, I'm lost. Okay, cool. Now we know where we are. How do we navigate from this point of lostness? And it turns out that's, I think, part of what I've been attempting to do for myself over the course of my life, and now in my profession as a coach, is to help us all understand better what is the way forward. First individually, and as I find my way forward, then how do we as a society and a culture begin to find our way forward? And there's a lot of echoes of Jordan Peterson in the way that I think and the things I have at this point concluded, lowercase c concluded, because he's been tremendously helpful to me. So I want to make sure I mention him, because he's shown a lot of light for me on the human condition and the good life, the good way forward. So I mentioned earlier that alliteration always helps. So I think what I'm offering is a paradigm, a pathway, and provisions for the pathway to help people understand themselves better, enjoy themselves more, and create the life they were made to live. Helping people understand themselves better is valuable, because when we have deeper self-knowledge about the kind of human that we are, then we can deploy ourselves in the world more intelligently, more effectively, and more satisfyingly. But many of us lack significant chunks of knowledge about the kind of human we are. Much like if you went onto a car lot and bought a car, you could operate that vehicle if you knew how to drive with very little knowledge of how it actually functions until such time as it breaks down.
Right.
And then if you're, somewhere fairly remote, the fact that you don't understand how this thing functions is actually a problem. And that's not a bad metaphor for what actually happens to us. We kind of coast on the knowledge that we have, and then some things start to break down, and we realize, I don't know what I'm working with here. I don't really know who I am or how to operate myself in the world. Deeper self-knowledge about the kind of human I am is one antidote to that kind of confusion we can encounter. And then the enjoy ourselves more piece has a twofold meaning. One is, as I deepen my self-knowledge about the kind of human I am, as apart from the kind of humans that some other people are, I can enjoy myself better. I can enjoy who I am. I understand who I am, and that helps me make sense of my place in the world. And as I be the person I'm discovering myself to be, it naturally, because I'm living in better alignment with the kind of human I am, my experience of life and of myself improves. And then finally, we can begin to create the life we were made to live. And made is a loaded word there, because that implies that there's something knowable about the path we are to tread in the future. And I believe that's true, because as we discover, just like you wouldn't ask a Ferrari to perform well in a Baja race, because it's not made for the desert. It's made for a well-paved track. We will often attempt to be a Ferrari on a Baja race, or to be a school bus on an F1 track. But if I can go, hold up, I'm a school bus, I'm not an F1 race car. Okay, how do school buses, what do they do in the world? And let's do more of that. And so with some courage and some humility and some truth-telling, which are three of the big six I've articulated for essential ingredients for how to live well, we can begin to live the life we were actually made to live, designed to live. And my worldview also comes into play there, and we don't have to go into that at this point, but there's a spiritual level worldview involved there.
Sure.
And then if we were to break down the paradigm, the pathway, and the provisions piece even further, I've jotted down what I think are a few of the key elements of the paradigm that I'm bringing to the table that we generally, and I think those in recovery, can use to great benefit. It would be to reiterate that the kind of human we are and the kind of life we were made to live don't need to remain elusive or a mystery. They are incrementally discoverable via a variety of reliable means and commitment to the work. So you can set about to learn about the kind of human you are and the life you're made to live, and you can discover incrementally answers to those questions. That bears out in my life, and it proves true in the life of the clients that I work with. And then secondly, we were made for capital A adventure, with all of the genuine peril that adventure entails. Again, there's that word made, so there's some presuppositions built into that, and genuine adventure is where we address the perils of our ignorance, because ignorance is one of the things that really crushes us. And so it's good to continue pushing back the frontiers of our ignorance and as we advance forward. Adventures are also the mechanism by which we become who we were made to be. So you go on a capital A adventure full of uncertainty, the kind of adventure we enjoy when we go and watch a movie. We would hate it if at the beginning of a movie they told us the ending, because the adventure's over. But most of us, by degree, are shrinking away from the adventures that could be ours because they're full of uncertainty and perils, failing to realize that in shrinking back from those, we are short-circuiting our ability to become who we can be, and as a result, to enjoy a much higher degree of meaning and fulfillment and contribution in the world. And then finally, adventure is the path that leads us to fulfillment of the purposes that we are uniquely made for. And then cultivating the spirit of adventure and voluntarily accepting the call to adventure are essential to living lives we'll be outrageously proud of when we die. This is all still part of the paradigm that I'm bringing to the table. And also, it's essential to voluntarily contemplate our own mortality in order to live well, because mortality is the ultimate ambivalence buster. It's the ultimate status quo buster. And in our lines of work, Mike, broadly speaking, one of the things we're always doing with clients is attempting to help them resolve ambivalence. I want to, but I don't want to. And until someone can begin to want to a little bit more than they don't want to, they'll remain stuck. And so you're looking for a way to resolve that ambivalence and get them moving in the direction of I want to. And in my own life, I had plenty of good reasons to not change about a decade ago. And then mortality showed up in the form of my brother-in-law's pretty grim cancer diagnosis. And I looked down at my 250 pound body and my protruding gut and my chain smoking habits and my overconsumption of alcohol. And I went, dude, your wife and your two boys would probably like to see you stick around a little longer, and you're not helping yourself stay alive. And in 9 months, I was lean and mean, overhauling my habits. Nothing in my life had ever kicked my butt in gear like an encounter with mortality. And ever since, I've been attempting to figure out how to leverage its gift even more and to pull it even closer. And I'm someone who, paradoxically, the form of anxiety I've experienced for many, many years, liked to latch on to fear of death and catastrophic health events. And as I've begun to practice developing the mortality mindset and pull mortality close, it's healed me. I mean, I really am. Go ahead.
Can you define that when you say mortality mindset?
Yeah. I mean, simply put, it is voluntary integration of the awareness of our mortality into our daily lives, into decision making, into prioritizing, into how I use my time and my energy. Do I stay late and continue and answer emails or go home and have dinner with my family would be a simple but not easy example. And also not just letting we've only got today be a platitude. Let it be a cosmic reality. I mean, we really have only got today, Mike, and maybe not even all of today. So don't start counting chickens before they hatch. Don't worry about tomorrow, today. What today would make today a good day? What would have made today worth living? And really living that way. Another question I ask people often, and I ask myself, is if you knew you were going to die 5 years from today, what would you start doing differently today? And I like the 5-year horizon because it's a little different than the 6 months or tomorrow kind of idea where most of us would probably get our affairs in order, spend time with loved ones, maybe take a bucket list trip, something like that. Those would be common answers. But if you've got 5 years to live, then you've got to still figure out what to do with all 365 days of each one of those 5 years. And it can't just be an extended farewell tour. So it tends to pressurize our thinking a little bit and go, well, gosh, if I was going to die 5 years from today, I can tell you one thing, I'd spend more time with my teenager. And that would mean changing some things at work. And so I probably go part-time at work, and you begin to really work through on a practical level the changes you would make. And the reality is we might not have 5 years. So I found it to be tremendously life-giving, and people often kind of shrink back in disgust or disdain or fear from the idea of embracing our mortality. And the sad thing is when we do that as humans, it's killing us. It's the only thing that's certain. And it's the one thing we avoid like the plague. And one of the guests I had on my podcast said one time that he believes that denial of and fear of death is complicit in most of the major modern woes and expressions of violence. And I was like, man, that's a big statement. But this guy's been working in this world for a long time on this kind of thing. And the more I thought about it, I thought, you know what? I think that holds up pretty well, because we're either actively avoiding death or unconsciously avoiding the reality of our death through a variety of ways. It can be simple avoidance and hedonism. It can be trying to perform, trying to stay super fit, trying to increase our longevity. But everything, it would seem, in one way or another, relates to the inevitability of our demise and our relationship with that.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, the final point on the paradigm bit is change yourself, which then changes your world, which then changes the world. And I think we live in an age that has gotten so outwardly focused on major hot button issues that, and it plays to the human instinct to separate ourselves from personal responsibility and instead to put it on the them out there. I think it's time for us to assume more personal responsibility and go from this hyper globalized age that we were to live into a hyper localized existence, so that I am assuming as much responsibility as I possibly can for myself and those immediately around me. And this is very Jordan Peterson-esque. As I find myself capable of fulfilling those responsibilities, then I can broaden the influence of my life, but only until then. But even if, and this is not a small thing, I was only really able to ever shoulder the responsibility for me and my family, that's not a small thing, especially if those around us are also doing the same thing. Because then each family unit or each unit of tightly integrated people is better than it was. And each of those people represents an ecosystem or a ring of concentric circles with influence in the world. And, I'm an idealist, so it's kind of easy to envision how that might, revolutionize the whole world. But in principle, it really would. And so assuming personal responsibility to change myself and realizing as I do that, it's changing my world. And as I change my world, the world is changing.
Right.
That's enough on the paradigm piece.
Well, I think that was really good. And several things that you said really kind of struck me. One, it ties to a paradigm so I was doing a presentation 2 days ago in California, and I always ask this question because I think it gauges where people are. And I asked the audience, have any of you ever worked with unmotivated clients? And it always ends up like everyone laughs and the hands go up. And to me, like that's really a problematic, like as a trauma therapist, I think that everyone is highly motivated, but mostly to stay as safe as possible. And what you're asking them to do on this, taking these risks and to this kind of journey, is there has to be a point at which there is a almost intellectual shift or awareness. And I use the example of, I tell the clients that I work with that I'm asking you to climb up a really high diving board. And it's so high that as you're climbing it, you can see people who have jumped off and are heading to the water. But when you get up there, you can't even see the water. But you've just seen 20 people go down and assume the best. And that really what you're asking people to do is to jump off that diving board, but in small increments at a time, to be a more manageable view. And in the counseling world, so often we see, like I get asked on a daily basis, what do you think I should do? And the vast majority of people never do it. So now when people ask me what I think they should do, I say, if I tell you, will you do it? And the answer is always the same. Well, it depends on what you tell me. And so, and I'm getting somewhere to make a point here, that so often people they want to be understood, they want to be supported, they want to believe that what they're doing and what they have been trying to do is valued and is recognized. But to take that step, to make that really significant paradigm shift to, I have to recognize and accept who I am, what I've been doing, and it isn't working, is like, you talked about ambivalence. And, we have models of therapy to deal with that. But so often people don't use it. And I work with families and we see that all the time. So if perception is way more important than reality, which is what my research has said, is that, reality has very little to do with what behaviors people engage in. How do you take that person in the earliest stages of everything from asking for help and not doing it to their perception of if I always hold to my perception, I have very little opportunity other than to do the same things over and over again. New insights result in new solutions. New solutions result in new behaviors. How do you help people make that shift? And maybe even before that, how do you hear that kind of, it's almost like it's the work before the work, like, or maybe it is the work, helping them to make that shift. What are your thoughts on that?
It's important for the person coming alongside the person who wants to change something and the person who wants to change something to get clear between them on, at least this is how I approach it, Mike. Is it clear that they don't want something badly enough, or that they do want another thing badly enough? And if there's some evidence that they don't want what they have any longer, or there's something clear to them that they do want, then the soil is fertile enough to begin the work. If it's just kind of general life improvement without any fires burning I think it's difficult, in my experience, for the person you're working with to get much out of it. We're pain motivated, powerfully pain motivated, and whether that's lower or uppercase P pain. And so finding a compelling enough why to begin the work becomes important. And then once we begin the work, as you mentioned earlier, you can't take someone to the top of a 100-meter diving board, if such a thing exists, and expect them to jump off. You have to do it incrementally. We start with the simple pathway. So it's a paradigm, pathway, and then provision. The simple pathway is insight plus action equals transformation. That's a pathway for human change. And I think that holds up across all instances of human change. And so we start first with insight on the kind of human that they are. And we use reliable, proven psychometric instruments to begin generating insight. And inevitably some insight is generated with these instruments, and they begin to compile a little bit better understanding of the kind of human they are, which then provisions them a little differently than they were provisioned. Oh, I see why during that period of my life, X was always so frustrating. Or I see why when I was doing this in college, I loved it so much. No wonder this is part of the kind of human that I am. Or I can see why this relational pattern has persisted because I've never gotten a handle on this part of my personality. So their history begins to be revised to align their perception better with reality. And then they can begin to assess their present and the future they want to create more intelligently and begin to make even more intelligent choices. As they begin to develop, in the course of developing these self-knowledge insights, what I call their personal owner's manual, which is, just what it sounds like, a way of describing the kind of human they are and ideal operating conditions, what the service and maintenance schedules ought to be, when they've had to operate outside of ideal operating conditions for a long time, what do they need to do in order to get back in good shape? Now they begin to feel a sense of themselves in the world, but that perhaps they didn't feel before. I understand myself better now. In fact, I'm enjoying myself a little bit more. I just made a few tweaks at work and the way I was talking to my boss, and I made a tweak in the way that I'm If I'm a student, I'm studying for my exams, and this feels more like me. Now they're prepared to begin taking on some of the, in my parlance or hero's journey parlance, some of the bigger dragons down the path on the way to some of the ultimate dragons they'll have to confront, behind which lies the gold that they're able to obtain on this journey. So insight plus action equals transformation. You create some insight, they commit to some real world action based upon that insight. That real world action then yields further insight, and wash, rinse, repeat. And as you go, you're creating incrementally over time transformation in that person. I've likened my own process to that of a snake shedding its skin. Another popular metamorphosis example would be the butterfly, but the butterfly is largely a passive experience. It's not a pleasant one because they liquefy in the cocoon and then come out a butterfly, but it's nevertheless a fairly passive experience as I understand it. But a snake shedding its skin is a very proactive and somewhat arduous experience for the snake, because in order for the skin to get off, it's got to rub itself over rough ground for a number of days before the skin comes off and the newer, bigger snake can emerge. And that's something like what can happen as we commit to this work. We gain more insight. We keep sort of dragging ourselves over the rough ground of action in the real world, some of which goes as expected, much of which doesn't, leads to deeper insights about our own failings and strengths and those kinds of things. But eventually, a different snake emerges. And then you get the beginnings of a positive feedback loop that tells you, look, I'm different. What happened? I could do that again. So not only do they create some instance of meaningful transformation in their lives, but they are transformed on a more fundamental level that tells them that I'm capable of deploying myself in the world with success and satisfaction. And it creates meaning and purpose. And it appears that I'm here for something. And in an age of desperation and apathy and nihilism and anxiety and depression, what an important thing for each of us to begin cultivating even more is a sense that I matter. I'm capable of finding my way in the world. I'm capable of making a difference in the world. And this is really enjoyable. Hard, yeah, but really much preferable to the other state I was living in. And I don't know what your experience is on the therapeutic side of things, but I think some of the instances of anxiety and depression that persist in people's lives, and I would count myself among them, are largely created, or at least significantly compounded by, the fact that our lives are actually somewhat depressing because we're not pushing forward boldly and courageously into the frontiers that are ours. We are not living out a movie we would want to watch. And then we go to the therapist and we say, I'm depressed, I don't know what's going on. And I'm not putting down any therapists because I'm on antidepressants, but they give you a med and maybe get some more sleep. And then we get into this self-care mode and begin to cultivate this finely calibrated self-care mechanism. And I'm not putting down self-care because that's important too, but we mistake that as an antidote when in fact it's just an element of maintenance. Like it's better to get more sleep than not. It's better than eat well than not. It's better to be flexible via yoga and to meditate than not, I would guess. But
Sure.
In none of those things is the deep sense of purpose and meaning that we long for as humans to be found. And so I think we're living in an age of sort of like we're poorly self-diagnosing. We probably are also being poorly diagnosed by many of those who are being charged to diagnose us. And then we go off on a treatment path that's not going to lead to anything but, chronic iterations of treatment. And in my own life, I've just found that as I have been willing to continue to move out onto new frontiers, those frontiers are the things that have created meaning and purpose and fulfillment in my life. And apart from the external changes reflect an inward transformation. And it's ultimately the inward transformation that we find so life-giving. Because even as we're inwardly transformed, the externalities of our life might not be getting a whole lot better. It might be getting worse. And you may see this in therapy sometimes. One person in a couple starts getting healthier and suddenly the relationship seems to be more on the rocks than it was before.
That's always, that's
Yeah.
a key issue.
So I'll stop there.
I mean, I think that's all great. And I think that it's what I guess what I was trying to talk a little bit about with the perception issue is our perception of the world is influenced by 3 generations of people before us,
Yeah.
and it's influenced by what's happened when we've tried to self-actualize, and we're in a system that doesn't support that kind of thing. And so, so much of what you're talking about is restoring, particularly with the depression piece and the anxiety piece, is that sometimes life is pretty depressing, and I feel pretty powerless, that this is my lot, this is how it's going to be. And so I agree with you. I think that that's a huge issue, and I agree with the idea of you start them by jumping off the low dive before they're jumping off the high dive. And I think it's what recovery really is. I mean, sobriety, sobriety is different than recovery. And everything from Maslow's hierarchy of need, with self-actualizing and finding oneself, is at the top of the hierarchy. That everything you're talking about is really critical to move from abstinence to sobriety to living a life of recovery, a life of self-actualized autonomy, with being autonomous. And so, do you have? I mean, I'm sure you do. Like certain protocols that you would like for someone who's listening to this who says, I told you this story about the guy who was in his 30s that called me and said, everything you just said is me. I don't know how to adult. I don't know how to adjust because that's never been a part of my life. So if someone's listening, like, give them an idea of what working with you would be like.
Yeah, I'd be glad to do that. And if you'll permit me, I want to touch real quickly on the self-actualization and Maslow's hierarchy piece. And I'm going to talk out of school since I'm not a pro in any of that stuff. But the idea of self-actualization is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my full potential is being realized and deployed in the world. And Maslow's hierarchy of needs talks about how until certain things are in place in your life, there's no opportunity to pursue self-actualization, like safety from harm. And just as an armchair psychologist, I've always taken issue with that, because it seems to me all you have to do is look at some of the poorest places in the world, like sub-Saharan Africa or parts of Asia, and see kids running around with beaming smiles who will go home maybe to a meal, maybe not, to realize that. And every kid I've known from the States who's gone to a place like that has come back going, I don't get it. They had nothing, but they were so happy. So to me, Maslow's hierarchy begins to sort of break down. It's nice as a way of formulating a hierarchy of needs, but I don't think it stands up to a rigorous test of reality precisely. I don't know how, there may be very adequate rebuttals to that, but I bring that up because I'm not saying this very clearly, but probably the way I approach things with folks is very different. I'm not aiming for sex actualization. That's great. Yeah, therapize me on that one.
Yeah.
I'm not aiming for self-actualization because, in fact, self-actualization could be a highly evolved form of misery. The hero's journey shows us that the hero is the one who sacrifices the most for others. And I think that's a part of the story that we're missing. And we've become so estranged from the old roads and become so hyper individualized and have so enthroned our subjective experience as the ultimate authority in our lives that we've lost sight of the fact that, in fact, it's when I'm giving the most of myself for others that I find the most joy and fulfillment. That's an ancient theme and an ancient narrative, and it shows up in many different places across spiritual traditions. Mm-hmm. But that's what the hero's journey, one of the key things that it shows us. And the hero's journey, of course, came from Joseph Campbell's work in the 20th century as a mythologist, looking at all of the major mythologies from humanity's past. And this theme kept emerging, this pattern of existence that was praised more highly than others. And it was present in every major mythology. And it was that of the person living in their ordinary world, being called to an adventure, initially resisting it, then finally accepting the adventure, and then plummeting into this underworld of uncertainty, peril, and unknowns internally and externally. And eventually they reach the innermost cave and they secure the gold and they emerge and they've killed the dragon and they return home, and then they bring back treasure for those who remain behind. And the hero has returned with outward treasure, inwardly transformed. A different person now returning to the same environment with the opportunity to transform that environment with the gifts that he or she brings. And that's why we enjoy the movies that we enjoy. That's why we don't, on some level, enjoy the movies that we don't enjoy, is because they don't ring true. They don't ring that theme that's as ancient as the existence of humans on the face of the earth. And so I think part of the way back for us is enthroning, again, things that are not us and our subjectivity merely, but objective truths that have held true over the whole span of human history, and being willing to submit ourselves to those and living according to those. And you were talking about perception and reality earlier. I think part of our challenge, as you were saying, is that perception equals reality. But if our perception is so far removed from reality, then our experience of life will be that much more intensely worsened. Anyway.
Yeah, it's interesting. I went to a lecture by a really noted trauma therapist and researcher, and he and a colleague had just written a book called Resilience. And they were studying Vietnam vets who were prisoners of war and found that most had post-traumatic stress disorder, but some didn't. And they were really trying to study, well, let's study the guys who didn't and see why they were different. And one of the things that he talked about was exactly what you were talking about with like sub-Saharan, but they were referring to some studies that were done with refugee camps from Syria. And that they found that when asked about hope and, the things that we would kind of look at from a resilient standpoint, that it was really different from Western culture. And Western culture tends to be optimistic based on expectation and based on condition. I'll be optimistic if these things happen. I'll be optimistic if things go this way. And in other cultures, these folks that had lost everything were like, yeah, tomorrow's another day. We're gonna get up. We're gonna do what we need to do. And so when I was listening to that, and when you were talking, I was thinking the same thing. Is how much of that is cultural, how much of that is money and security and those kinds of things. And I think Maslow's hierarchy of need, from my perspective as a trauma therapist, is I spend very little time at the top of that. And I spend the vast majority, for me, it's like being able to look at the hierarchy and say, where's the starting point? And so
what's missing here?
I think, if you ask really traumatized individuals that have kind of really embraced their survivorhood, they might say, I've been on a hero's journey since I was 5 years old. And that I'm just now beginning to realize I can take a step up higher on that hierarchy to do some things that are really remarkable. And I think that's kind of what I heard you kind of saying is like, let's not get bogged down on safety I think there has to be an element of solution or an element of safety to jump off the diving board, as we're using that analogy. And so, I spend very little time looking at self-actualization and much more on what's the story that you want to create. And I do think reality is a story that we wrote. Not just reality, but our perception of reality is the story that we've written about truth in the world. And helping people to take that step past that perception into the world of risk and the world of adventure, as you would put it, is actually what recovery is built on. Excuse me.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
Yeah, I think perhaps how I approach it and others approach it may diverge significantly, is that my conviction is that there is a reality that is objective and can be approached as such and known as such, and with which we can align our thoughts and our words and our deeds. And in doing so, because it is an objective reality that exists apart from us, as we align ourselves with it, we will find things will go better for us. Not everyone believes that, though. I do believe that, and it corresponds with my experience of reality. And the more I double down on that, the more my experience of reality produces things that I enjoy. Now, that doesn't mean riches. It just means a quality of existence. And I think I feel probably especially called to help we in the affluent Western world who have mistaken our very comfortable reality, all things considered, for a destination rather than a launch pad, and think that our comfort or in some rearrangement of our comforts will be found satisfaction. And I did a podcast episode on this. It'd be like a big mountain climber who has, for all of his or her life, dreamed of getting to a particular big mountain summit. And they finally are ready to do it. And they set off up the high mountain valley to base camp. And they get to base camp and then go, you know what? Base camp is really nice. They've got a kitchen tent. There's facilities. I don't have to use supplemental oxygen. They cook for me every night. I can sleep better here. I'm good. I'm going to stay here. That wouldn't make sense to someone who had aspired to summit that mountain. It would be a complete non sequitur. Like, what are you doing, man? Like, no, get ready to go higher. And I think that's it's a decent way of understanding what we've done in the Western world. We have achieved through hard-won efforts over many years the kind of comfort, convenience, and freedom from pain and suffering of a physical sort that we now enjoy, but it's also killing us because we've stopped there rather than seeing it as a place of unprecedented resourcing in the history of the world. Not everyone, of course, sees it this way, but many of us have stopped here because it is so comfortable. This is good. This is nice. I'll just keep trying to perpetuate this comfort. But the perpetuation of comfort does nothing for us because we're not made for that. And so I hope that we in the Western world can be one by one awakened to return to the old roads, to the way that we're really made to live, and begin responding to the call to adventure, not out there to the big hot button adventures that are available merely, but to the adventure that of our own life that's right here in front of us. And if any of us were to pause and for a week just ask ourselves, not pause for a week, but for a week just sort of tune in, what is the adventure that's calling to me? 100% of the time, if we're honestly listening, we're going to begin to get an idea of the adventure that's calling to us, that's not calling to anyone else. And, for those in the recovery world, it's not a substantial enough adventure. Recovery is not a substantial enough adventure. It's a waypoint along the way of your life's great adventure, because there's something beyond recovery for you. Now, surely it will involve the story of your recovery, because I think our purpose and our story in the world are inseparable. Just like Mike, you were talking earlier about how you're really good at crisis and really good at abstraction, and not so good at the planning and all that kind of stuff. And I thought, well, man, your purpose and your story are inseparable, Mike. You came from a household of chaos. You got good at crisis. You had to start figuring out why all this was happening and how to find your way in the world. And boom, here you are helping others do precisely the same thing. And so, yeah, I'll stop there. Well, you're asking me earlier, what are the actual, what's the actual process? So, the basic pathway is insight plus action equals transformation. The provisions, then the process is a custom configuration of provisions that equip the person for the adventure of their lives. And very often when I work with clients, I say, hey, you've enlisted me as a companion and an ally on your adventure. You're the adventurer, you're Frodo in Lord of the Rings, and you have some idea of where you don't want to be and maybe an inkling of where you do want to be. But everything that lies between here and there is completely unknown to both of us. I'm here to help you. What I've got in my backpack are a bunch of things that I know prove useful on a trip like this, and I've used them a bunch of times on adventures like this. I don't know when each one will come into service, but it's likely that we'll use most of them, maybe even multiple times. So let's use a couple of them now to set the stage and make sure we're packed appropriately for our adventure, and then let's just set out. and let's see what happens. And so very often the personal owner's manual comes into the mix. What's your nature? What's your nurture? The influence of your story upon your nature. And what are the now factors that influence the way you deploy what you learn from exploration of your nature and your nurture? For example, if you're a 50-year-old who, through an exploration of nature and nurture, realizes that his 6-year-old dream to be an astronaut still holds, we go, okay, so what are the now factors that influence whether or not you pursue that? Well, I've got 3 kids. One's about to go to college. I'm 50. I don't know if they take 50-year-olds into the space program. Now also includes values and a variety of other things. So nature, nurture, and now all sort of govern one another, and now ultimately provides some of the final governing factors about what you do as you move forward in the world. Hero's journey comes very much into play as a paradigm for understanding how we move through the world. The big 6. So there's a variety of provisions that come into play in a bespoke way with any one person or group that I would work with. The basic divisions of that process are, first, I would say, roughly speaking, introspection, and then looking out to see what adventure is calling to us and summoning the courage and the means to move forward on that adventure.
Yeah, that's, I mean, that is so much the work that these, these individuals that have been so stuck in the rut of not only the addiction, but the constraining beliefs that say, this is what I have to do, rather than there's a world out there of things that I could do. And so if someone wanted to get a hold of you, how would they do that?
AndrewPettyCoach.com. I'm on all the typical socials, save Twitter and TikTok at Andrew Petty Coach. My podcast is on YouTube at Andrew Petty Coach. Just started posting in video, and you can always email me, Andrew@AndrewPettyCoach.com.
I think someone had asked me the other day, well, if you had one more big task in your career, what would it be? And I said it would be to create a treatment environment that would be able to do what you were talking about, but not just that, but that idea of the recognition of habilitation. And that's really what you're talking about, is allowing people to find out that the constraints aren't necessarily real. They certainly feel real, but how do you take that dive off the board? How do you give yourself permission to dream about adventure, about being and doing what you want? And I just think we have so many younger guys that are struggling not only to get sober, but to find a place in the world. That the work that you're talking about is exactly what they need.
And that's been the great adventure of my adulthood, is trying to find my place in the world and to grow myself up, and I'm finding success as I continue to push forward on frontiers by God's grace. And so have walked that road, and so I can attest that there is a way forward. And I think we live in an age that assumes fragility and goes to great lengths to protect and to tiptoe around various things, and unfortunately that's very destructive to the human spirit ultimately. Even though it may feel good in the moment, when we consider ourselves fragile, then we will be. And I think it's a time for many of us to realize, I'm not fragile. I can actually take on a lot, and it would be good for me to take on more, actually. And Jordan Peterson talks much about how responsibility is a pathway to freedom. And I was attempting to articulate that a while back, that the path to freedom is paved with greater and greater levels of self-responsibility and the responsibility for others as is appropriate. So rather than, trying to carefully curate these lives of balance and harmony, I think we need to head courageously into the fray, because it's there that we are tested and proved and refined, and it's there that we find ourselves, and it's there that we begin to move beyond the gravitational pull that self-destructive habits and addictive patterns have had on us, because suddenly the story we're creating is so much more compelling that we wouldn't dare compromise it with those kinds of behaviors any longer. I've got something to live for.
It's interesting. I believe that we have a traumatized society. I think that as a society we are like that protection. And as you were talking about that, it made me kind of laugh to myself a little bit about when our son got hit by the car when he was 5. And my wife and I found that we just wanted to bubble wrap him so that he never got hurt again. And then we realized it has nothing to do with him. It has to do with we can't take another catastrophe like that. And I think as a society, it's really why I have been pushing this idea of secondary and systemic trauma, and that families have to kind of come to terms with that. And I think we have to do the same thing as a society, to say how much of what we're doing is out of fear, how much of what we're doing is out of anger, And I think if we can start with, each individual specifically, we can make a huge shift societally. But it's a pretty hazy world out there, in terms of allowing oneself to take those risks that we're talking about.
I think part of it is what do we consider most worth preserving? And when we are subordinated to a subjective view of existence and are unclear about what comes next, then the thing that is most worth preserving is the breath in my lungs and the breath in my loved one's lungs. But I believe there's worse things than death, Mike. And some of those include not really living. And as we persist in not really living in order to attempt to preserve our lives and elongate them, we then inflict upon others our fear. And that then perpetuates in them the parts of them that are fearful and holding back and subject to resentment and victimhood. You've probably been around someone, and you've probably been yourself on occasion the person who steps out and does the thing that clearly has uncertainty and requires a lot of courage, and heard from someone later, man, I couldn't believe you did that. But when you did that, I was like, maybe I could do that. And so I did the thing. And so the person that we present to the world, everything to do with the way the world is evolving. If I present to it the desperate version of Andrew who's hell-bent on perpetuating breath in and out of my lungs, then that's what that's the seed I'm going to sow in the world, and that's the crop I'm going to produce. And I think on some level we see evidence of that across Western culture. And again, sort of the deification and the enthronement of the subjective experience, which philosophically speaking leads to a breakdown in intelligibility and coherence, which we're seeing on a massive scale. So there's worse things than dying.
Well, that might be the right place to end on. The infusion, as you were saying, sort of the recognition of mortality and what do I need to, how do I live rather than be constantly fearful that I won't live.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for your time.
Thank you, Mike. This has been great to continue figuring out how to think through and talk through these things and find where they hold up and where they don't, and where they make sense to me and where they don't, and where they might make sense to you and where they don't. And
Yeah,
appreciate your brain and your time and making some available to me today.
Okay, sounds good. See ya.
See ya.